The book of 2nd Samuel. Check out the video on 1 Samuel where we were introduced to the book's three main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David, and then also to the book's literary design, which first introduced Samuel and then traced the rise and fall of King Saul. Check out the video on 1 Samuel where we were introduced to the book's three main characters. 2 Samuel tells.
And I say to all those who did their homework and read through 1 Samuel, well done. But since 1st and 2nd Samuel were written as one book, we'll attempt to cover them both today. After all, Samuel is really only about three main characters: Samuel, Saul, and David. There were bigger characters like Goliath and his brothers, but they were all put to sleep one by one. Samuel was a prophet, a priest, and a judge. As a prophet, he told the people what God wanted. As a priest, he told God what the people wanted. As a judge, he helped the people to maintain order within their communities. Under God's command, he anointed Saul and later David as kings of Israel. The Samuel story starts out sad in the little village of Ramoth, just north of the city Jebus, which would become Jerusalem when David conquers it about a century later. Elkanah, from the tribe of Ephraim, had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had lots of kids. Hannah, none. Each year the family would travel to the tabernacle in Shiloh to worship. One year, after much taunting from Peninnah, Hannah goes to the entrance of the tabernacle in tears. She prays desperately for a son, vowing to give him back to God, to serve God always. God heard Hannah's plea. Samuel was born. Samuel means God hears. So every time you hear reference to the book of Samuel, remember, God hears. He was taken as a child to the temple to be trained in the ways of a priest. Hannah would come to visit each year on their annual trip to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Samuel learnt, while still a child, to listen to God when he called. Hannah records her joy over all that the Lord had done for her, but also for the nation. We will listen to some of her prayer of praise later. If you don't know the stories about God speaking to young Samuel, about the battles between the Israelites and the Philistines, the tall, good-looking warrior Saul becoming king, or young David defeating giant Goliath, you now know where to find these stories. 1 Samuel. There are dozens more stories of heroism, failures, humble repentance, and absolute trust in God. So many lessons we could learn. Through it all, El Shaddai, the almighty, faithful, and caring God, is working his purposes out, preparing a nation to be his own. The character flaws of King Saul are exposed. Humility was not in his vocabulary. How can a nondescript Bethlehem shepherd boy like David, youngest in his family, become a king? What made him able to trust the Lord God with his life? What sort of man cries at the death of his enemies? The stories of David's escapes and absolute loyalty to God and the men in his army make for exciting reading, but not today. We'll watch the video, 1 Samuel now. Thank you.
The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're two separate books in our modern Bibles, but that division is due simply to scroll length. It was originally written as one coherent story. We're just going to cover the book of 1 Samuel in this video. After Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt, they made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai and eventually came into the Promised Land. And there, Israel was supposed to be faithful to God and obey the covenant commands. Before the book of Samuel, Judges showed how Israel failed at that task big time. It was a period of moral chaos, and it showed Israel's need for wise, faithful leaders. The book of Samuel provides an answer to that need. The book of Samuel's story focuses on three main characters: the prophet Samuel, where the book gets its name, and then King Saul, and after that, King David. And all three of them transitioned Israel from a group of tribes ruled by judges into a unified kingdom ruled by King David in Jerusalem. And the book of Samuel has a fascinating design that weaves the story of these three characters together in four main parts. Samuel, he's the key leader and prophet in the first section of the book. But then he also plays a key role in the next section, which is Saul's story, and it's told in two movements: Saul's rise to power and then his failures. And the second part is about his downfall and his tragic death. And then the drama of Saul's demise is matched by David's exciting rise to power. And then David's story is told in two movements. First, he rides the wave of his success, followed by his own tragic failure and the slow self-destruction of his family and then his kingdom. The book concludes with an epilogue that reflects back over the whole story. So let's dive in and see how this all unfolds. Part 1 picks up from the chaos of the book of Judges, and we're introduced to a touching story about a woman named Hannah. And she's grieved because she has never been able to have children. And by God's grace, she finally has a son named Samuel. And in joy, she sings this amazing poem in chapter 2. And the poem is all about how God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, about how despite tragedies and human evil, God is working out his purposes in history. And also it's about how God will one day raise up an anointed king for his people. Now, Hannah's poem has been placed here at the beginning of the book to introduce these key themes that we're going to see throughout the whole story, like the next one. Samuel grows up and becomes a great prophet and leader for the people of Israel, at the same time that the Philistines rise to power as Israel's arch nemesis. In this crucial battle, the Israelites get arrogant, and instead of praying and asking God for help, they trot out the Ark Covenant as this kind of magic trophy that will automatically grant them victory in battle. And so because of their arrogant presumption, God allows Israel to lose the battle and the ark is stolen. So the Philistines, they take the ark and they place it in the temple of their god, Dagon. And then the God of Israel defeats the Philistines and the god Dagon without an army by sending plagues on the people. And then the Philistines don't want the ark anymore, obviously, and they send it back to Israel. And the point of this little story seems to be this: God is not Israel's trophy, and he opposes pride among the Philistines, but also among his own people. And so Israel needs to remain humble and obedient if they want to experience God's covenant blessing, which opens up into the next large section. The Israelites come to Samuel and they say, hey, we want a king like all the other nations have. Go find one for us. And so Samuel, he's kind of ticked off and he goes to consult with God. And God says, yes, their motives are all wrong, but if a king is what they want, give them one. So we're introduced to the figure of Saul. Now, Saul is a tragic figure because he begins full of promise. He's tall, he's good-looking, he's a perfect candidate for a king. But he has deep character flaws. He's dishonest, he lacks integrity, and he seems incapable of acknowledging his own mistakes. And so these flaws become his downfall. He wins some battles at the beginning, but his flaws run so deep, he eventually disqualifies himself by blatantly disobeying God's commands. And so the aging Samuel confronts Saul and Israel. He had warned the people that they would only benefit from a king who's humble and faithful to God. Otherwise, the kings of Israel will bring ruin. So he informs Saul that God is going to raise up a new king to replace him. And so Saul's downfall begins, as God at the same time is working behind the scenes to raise up that new king. It's an insignificant shepherd boy named David. He's the least likely candidate to be king, but the famous story of David and Goliath shows that God's choice of David is not based on his family status, but simply on his radical and humble trust in the God of Israel. And this story embodies all of the themes of Hannah's poem. Proud Saul and Goliath are brought low, while humble David is exalted. Here we watch Saul slowly descend into madness, while David rises to power. So David starts working for Saul as a general, and he's winning all of the battles, winning all of the fame. And so Saul gets jealous, and he starts chasing around, hunting him, trying to kill him. David's done nothing wrong. And so David simply runs and waits in the wilderness. And here we see David's true character. He has multiple opportunities to kill Saul, but he doesn't. He simply trusts that despite Saul's evil, God will raise up a king for his people. What's interesting, too, is that many of the poems of David that you find in the book of Psalms are linked to this very period of his life, and they all express the same attitude of trust. And so this section of the book ends with Saul coming to a grisly death after losing a battle with the Philistines. 1 Samuel tells some of the most intricate, well-told stories you find anywhere in the Bible, and the characters Saul and David, they're portrayed very realistically. And the author's putting them forward as character studies so that you can find yourself in them. So in Saul's story, we see a warning. It's crucial that we reflect on our own character flaws and how they harm us and other people. And with God's help, we need to humble ourselves and deal with our dark side so that Saul's story doesn't become ours. David, on the other hand, is presented as an example of patience and trust in God's timing in our lives. And so he's running in the wilderness, being chased by Saul. David had every reason to think that God had abandoned him, but that's not what he thinks. And David's story encourages us to trust that despite human evil, God is working out his purposes to oppose the proud and to exalt the humble. And that's what 1 Samuel is all about.
As we come to the second video, here we find a man who talks to God, asks God questions, and gets answers. He wins battles because God is with him. He wants to build a temple fit for God. But God says, no, I'll build a house for you. David too has flaws. His sins cause many deaths. What makes him different from Saul? How could he possibly be part of God's ultimate plan? Let's watch.
The book of 2nd Samuel. Check out the video on 1 Samuel where we were introduced to the book's three main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David, and then also to the book's literary design, which first introduced Samuel and then traced the rise and fall of King Saul in contrast to the rise of King David. 2 Samuel tells the story of David as Israel's king, and in two movements. There's a season of success and of blessing, followed by a huge moral failure and then its sad consequences. And then the book ends with this well-crafted conclusion that reflects back on the good and the bad in David's life, generating hope for a future king to come from his line. So 2 Samuel picks up after Saul's death, and David surprises everyone by composing this long poem where he laments the death of the very man who tried to murder him. And so once again, the author, he's presenting David's humility and compassion. He's a man who grieves the death even of his own enemies. After this, David experiences a season of success and God's blessing. All of the Israelite tribes, they come to David and then they ask him to unify all the tribes as their king. And so the first thing David does as king is to go to the city of Jerusalem. He conquers it, and he establishes it as Israel's capital city, which he renames as Zion. And from there, David goes on and he wins many battles and expands Israel's territory. Now, after making Jerusalem the political capital of Israel, he wants to make it their religious capital as well. And so he has the Ark of the Covenant moved into the city. And then in 2 Samuel 7, he tells God, now that Israel has a permanent home, he thinks that God's presence should also get a permanent house. So he asks if he can build a temple for the God of Israel. But God says to David, thank you for that thought, but actually I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty. Now, 2 Samuel 7, this is a key chapter for understanding the storyline of the whole Bible, because God here makes a promise to David that from his royal line will come a future king who's going to build God's temple here on earth and set up an eternal kingdom. And it's this messianic promise to David that gets picked up and developed more in the book of Psalms and also in the books of the prophets. And it's this king that gets connected to God's promise to Abraham. The future messianic kingdom will be how God brings his blessing to all of the nations. And it's right here, in the midst of all this divine blessing, that things go horribly wrong. David makes a fatal mistake. Not fatal for him, but for a man named Uriah, one of David's prize soldiers. So from his rooftop, David sees Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, bathing. David finds her, he sleeps with her, gets her pregnant, and then he tries to cover the whole thing up by having Uriah assassinated and then marrying her. It's just horrible. So when David's confronted by the prophet Nathan about all of this, he immediately owns up to what he's done. He's broken, he repents, he asks God to forgive him, and God does forgive him, but God doesn't erase the consequences of David's decisions. And so as a result of this horrible choice, David's family, his kingdom, it all falls apart. And it makes this section a tragic story, much like Saul's downfall. So David's sons end up repeating his own mistakes, but in even more tragic ways. So Amnon sexually abuses his sister Tamar, and then their brother Absalom finds out about all of this and has Amnon assassinated. And then Absalom goes and he hatches the secret plan to oust his father David from power, and he launches this full-scale rebellion. And so for a second time, David is forced to flee from his own home and go hide in the wilderness, except this time he is not an innocent man. The rebellion ends when David's son is murdered, and it breaks David's heart. And so once again, he laments over the very man who tried to kill him. David's last days find him back on his throne, but as a broken man, he's wounded by the sad consequences of his sin. The book concludes with a well-crafted epilogue, with stories that are out of chronological order, but they have this really cool symmetrical literary design. So the outer pair of stories come from earlier in David's reign, and they compare the failures of Saul and then of David, and how each of them hurt other people through their bad decisions. The next inner pair of stories are about David and his band of mighty men who went about fighting the Philistines. And what's interesting is that both sections have a story of David's weakness in battle. So in contrast to the victorious David of chapters 1 through 9, here we see a vulnerable David who's dependent on others for help. The center of the epilogue has two poems that act like memoirs, and David reflects back on his life. And he remembers times when God graciously rescued him from danger. And he sees these as moments where God was faithful to his covenant promise to him and to his family. Both poems conclude by looking back onto the hope of God's promise of a future king who will build that eternal kingdom. Now these poems and then God's promise also connect back to Hannah's poem that opened the book. And so these key passages from the beginning, now the middle, and the end of the book bring the book's themes all together. Despite Saul and David's evil, God remained at work, moving forward his redemptive purposes. And God opposed David and Saul's arrogance, but he exalted David when he humbled himself. And so the future hope of this book reaches far beyond David himself. It looks to the future, to the Messianic King who will one day bring God's kingdom and blessing to all of the nations. And that's what the book of Samuel is all about.
Yes, you can see why we wanted to do the whole thing together. As I read through these stories, I saw a pattern. Those who talked with God were blessed, especially as they were humble, as they owned up when they had sinned against God or fellow man. God is gracious and forgiving. If we too allow God to show us our failings, and if we will confess them, God is listening. Are you tuned in to the Lord? King Saul refused to obey God, to listen to God. Will you? Jenny and Steve are going to read out to us now 2 prayers. They're both been put to songs in the Jewish Bible. But the first, Jenny's going to read out Hannah's prayer, a part of it at least, and the other prayer is from King David. I'm going to get them to do their part now, please. These 2 prayers are about 100 years apart, but they're going to read part of each one as they go through, and we can just see how they match up with what God's got in mind. Thanks, Jen. I'll stay.
Then Hannah prayed, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. The Lord has made me strong. Now I have an answer for my enemies. I rejoice because you rescued me. No one is holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God."
David, the son of Jesse, speaks. The Spirit of the Lord speaks through me. His words are upon my tongue. The God of Israel spoke. The Rock of Israel said to me, "The one who rules righteously, who rules in the fear of God, is like the light of morning at sunrise, like a morning without clouds, like the gleaming of the sun on new grass after rain."
He lifts the poor from the dust and the needy from the garbage dump. He sets them among princes, placing them in seats of honour. For all the earth is the Lord's, and he has set the world in order. He will protect his faithful ones, but the wicked will disappear in darkness. No one will succeed by strength alone.
Is it not my family God has chosen? Yes, he has made an everlasting covenant with me. His agreement is arranged and guaranteed in every detail. He will ensure my safety and success.
Those who fight against the Lord will be shattered. He thunders against them from heaven. The Lord judges throughout the earth. He gives power to his king. He increases the strength of his anointed one.
But the godless are like thorns to be thrown away, for they tear the hand that touches them. One must use iron tools to chop them down. They will be totally consumed by fire.
Thank you, Jenny and Steve. Hannah's prayer at the beginning of 1 Samuel finishes with, "The Lord judges throughout the earth. He gives power to his king. He increases the strength of his anointed one." When Hannah prayed that, there was no king in Israel yet. David's last words at the end of 2 Samuel include, "Is it not my family God has chosen? Yes, he has made an everlasting covenant with me. His agreement is arranged and guaranteed in every detail." We can actually see God's eternal plan being revealed through those who listen to God and talk to him, in spite of their failings. To finish, I'd like to share a story with you. A pastor heard about a weekend retreat for dads and their teenage daughters. An opportunity for dads to get to understand and appreciate their girls, and for daughters to grow closer to their dad. The pastor and his daughter signed up for the weekend. All was going well. One activity was to go for a walk in the nearby forest. The group leader explained that first, each dad needed to give his daughter 3 simple instructions and make sure they could remember them and repeat them back. The first instruction was, I will never leave you. I will never leave you. Okay. The second instruction was, you can ask me anything. You can ask me anything. The third instruction was, you should only listen to the sound of my voice. You should only listen to the sound of my voice. Only when everyone had complied did they set out for their walk. But the daughters were blindfolded. The dads would keep hold of their daughter's hand. And at a signal from the group leader, the pastor and the other dads were to let go of their daughter's hand, but to continue to give them directions, describing what lay ahead. After a short while, at another signal, the dads were to stop speaking and wait. The pastor's daughter stopped still, not knowing what to do. The group leader noticed this and came over and asked the daughter, could he guide her? He led her into a gully and up to a tree. Then he stopped speaking. It only took a moment before the daughter called out to her father, who was right there in tears. Dad, are you there? It's a conscious decision to ask, are you there, Dad? God is always there. He is listening. I'd like to just stop and ask you to pause now and to think, is there something that you need to talk to your dad about, just privately, before we go into open worship? Let's just bow our heads and individually just talk to God, just briefly, especially if there's something that you should be talking to him about. Let's bow. Father, help us to listen. Help us to be ready to talk. Amen.